and a very warm welcome to all of you to the Sound of Economics, Bruegel's economic podcast. My name is Guntram Wolf and I'm the director of Bruegel. And today I'm very pleased. Today is the first time of this year, the first podcast of 2021. And I'm very pleased to host today Minister Michal Kurtyka, who is the Minister for Climate and Environment of Poland. And as his Wikipedia page says, he is a technocrat and a non-partisan figure. And of course, he is very well known for jumping in 2018 over the table at the COP24 meeting, which took place in Poland. And he's also seen within Poland as a champion of climate policy that is ambitious. Now, thank you for joining us, Minister, and a very warm welcome.
Thank you very much for inviting me and starting the year with this perspective.
Thank you. And of course, climate policy is beyond COVID one of the central policies that we are debating that will move this year and where important decisions will be taken. And Poland is in these discussions one of the central players. In some regions, in some parts of the world, Poland is considered an obstacle to ambitious climate policy, partly related to the very important coal sector. I think a number, just to give here one number, is that in 2019, more than 70% of the electricity that Poland generated was still from coal. And of course, the coal industry is also quite an important industry in Poland with regional jobs attached to it. Minister, perhaps I can ask you sort of as a start to characterize a bit your take on Polish climate policy and whether you think it's actually fair that sometimes Poland is seen as a sort of scapegoat or a bad pupil, if I can say so, in international climate ambitions.
Thank you. With this question, I don't think it's fair. And in order to answer fully, we have to come back 30 years ago when all this transformation started. And Poland started with three challenges, three weaknesses. One is a complete monoculture, coal monoculture. And that's the unique situation within Europe. And also, as you see around our neighbors, all of them had diversified sources of production of electricity, including nuclear playing an important role in Lithuania, in Ukraine, in Czechoslovakia, in all Central European countries. And only Poland started the transition in 1989 with 97% share of coal in the energy production. So that's part of our heritage. The second weakness, complete dependence on one source of supply of gas coming only from our eastern neighbor. And then last but not least, a relatively new fleet of coal-based units in the late 70s, 80s, and a big decrease in industrial production in the beginning of 90s. So no need immediately to build new capacities, and existing capacities having quite a heavy burden on energy prices and on share of energy within households. Because in Poland, we still have 10% share of energy-related expenses in the households' revenues compared with 5% in Germany. So less room for immediately engaging into new investments. So it's triple dependency: coal, no alternative immediately in terms of gas, and economic and social challenges made Poland continue on its path for 30 years. But right now we have to see differently. And I think behind this monolithic image you said about Poland, there is a reality which is much more wealthy and much more diversified. And I think it's always interesting to see that in Poland right now we have more than 11,000 megawatts of renewables, installed capacities in renewables. And when I speak saying to my colleagues that we have more wind than Denmark, then people are opening their eyes and saying, wow, I didn't believe it. I thought you have nothing. Yeah? But there is a lot which is happening in Poland. 48% of our electricity during the last Christmas was provided by renewables in our system. And we are right now, I think 2020 is the year where lots of things are changing in Poland. Photovoltaics is skyrocketing, the system is changing, and public awareness of the climate and environmental challenge is rising to the point never seen before. And I think it's also somehow a heritage of COP24 you mentioned, which occurred in Katowice.
Perhaps you can say one or two more words about how the perception and how the domestic politics, of which, of course, I know very little, how that is evolving on coal. I mean, I do remember that the closing of coal mines in Silesia and so on has been extremely controversial. And I also seem to remember that there was also a big discussion when COVID hit about the closing of some coal mines for sanitary reasons and whether that was now a first step to really get out of coal more quickly. And lastly, there was also the discussion about a nuclear power plant, which was an important complement to diversify away from coal. So if you could say a little bit about both the politics, but also more concretely about what are the measures within Poland before we then move to the more European topics, which are around the recovery fund and the external dimensions of Europe's climate policy. But I think our readers, our listeners would love to hear a bit more from you on the Polish measures and the Polish political discussion around this topic.
Again, in order to understand the social sensitivity behind transformation of the mining system, we have to come back to early 90s, where in many areas in Poland, in many regions, we had to close in a very brutal manner a lot of industrial and manufacturing facilities, including mines. And for example, Wałbrzych area or Bytom area were completely impacted by the fact that within few years, all industry collapsed within these regions. And we can see right now a difference in terms of unemployment, for example, between Bytom and Katowice, two neighboring cities, one with 3% unemployment, Katowice, another one with 9% of unemployment, which is still the heritage of a very brutal closure of mining sector and steel facilities in Wałbrzych in the mid of 90s. So we keep this memory of a very badly managed transition. And this is why this idea of just transition and not leaving anybody behind is a very important element of our thinking of the transition of energy. This is why also I put this at the heart of COP24. When we started COP24, the 2nd of December 2018, we adopted Silesia Declaration on Just Transition and Solidarity, because if we want to think about climate policy, we think it's very difficult to think without this social sensitivity. But right now, we have also a very different situation in terms of economic paysage. When in 1989, 400,000 people worked in the mining sector, now we have only 80,000 working in the mining sector. And Silesia alone have more value added from the manufacturing in the automobile industry than in the mining industry. So there are alternatives right now, yes? And this is a very different discussion right now, which is confirmed by also a social negotiation between trade unions and the government, foreseeing the closure of mines at our biggest utility, PGG, by 2049. And on top of that, there is this fact that the Polish energy system needs an evolution, needs to be transformed. And this is where I presented the new draft of energy policy, which foresees that within next 20 years, we will build in Poland a new zero emission system, which is of the size comparable to the existing conventional one. And components of this zero emission systems are, first of all, decentralized bottom-up PV system, which needs to be adjusted because PV is fundamentally not a continuous source of production of electricity. So we need these buffers, yes? What I call 3H. We need hydrogen and heat as ways to absorb excess of electricity when intermittent renewables are producing them, and at the same time storing for later usage. So that's the basis. We have already achieved 300,000 prosumers within Polish system. PV is skyrocketing. The first 1,000 megawatts of photovoltaics, it took us 8 years to achieve them. Last 1,000 megawatts, only 8 months. And that's the first thing. The second thing is offshore wind. And we just adopted in Sejm our law on offshore wind, which is creating a completely new sector of activity targeting between 8 to 11,000 megawatts of offshore wind installed capacity by 2040 on Polish Baltic Sea seashore. And we also proposed to our neighbors, to our partners in the Baltic Sea, a global cooperation on the offshore wind. And this is how we signed in Szczecin in the late September last year, Pomeranian Declaration on offshore wind with 8 countries together with European Commission. And then you mentioned this. We entered again in this transition only with coal. At the same time when, for example, in Germany, many other sources of production of electricity existed. In Sweden, among our, let's say, close partners, such as nuclear. And the question is, how can we replace stable production of electricity to the needs of the industrial sector when coal will be progressively losing its share with some other stable and dispatchable source of energy? This is why the word nuclear has been pronounced, and this is why nuclear is the third pillar of Polish energy policy.
Thank you very much. And I think you mentioned many very, very important points, of course, but one point very interesting, very important, and I want to also turn to Georg on that point, which is about the just transition and the question of social equality, the social impact of this, probably one of the biggest transformations that all of our economies are undergoing as they decarbonize. So this decarbonization issue and how to do it in a just and socially acceptable way is key. I can say, of course, from the perspective of someone who grew up actually in North Rhine-Westphalia, and so in the west of Germany, which is a sort of coal and mining region, it was one of the most painful and long-lasting processes to get out of coal in North Rhine-Westphalia. And it was extremely difficult politically to do this and very socially contested. And at the time, the coal mines were shut down not because of climate issues, but because of basically competitiveness issues. Coal from elsewhere was much cheaper than the German coal. But I do remember the impact on society and the social issues. So just transition, I think, is a very important concept and a very important word. And of course, there are some EU funds that are supposed to help with this just transition. And perhaps, Georg, you can say a few words about your research on just transition, but also a bit more broadly on how the EU money, the recovery fund, will help or will not help, and what is being planned for Poland in that respect.
Thank you, Guntram. And thank you, Minister. We did some work during the past 2 years on distributional effects of climate policies. And our approach has been to say there is very different elements to the social implications of climate policies. It's not only on the side of the coal miners and the producing regions. There we will have very strong regional effects on the corresponding producers, but there's also a significant effect on the side of the consumers. that will see higher heating prices, higher electricity prices, and we expect that those prices will more strongly affect poorer households than richer households. Having said that, one of the conclusions of the work that we have been doing is that of all the big policy menu that you can introduce with standards, with subsidies, with supporting low carbon technologies, still carbon prices are among those policies with the most benign distributional effects, simply for the reason that you can take the income from the carbon pricing and give it back to households to some degree. And on the other hand, that if you spend money on incentivizing investments, if you spend money on helping rich people buy an electric vehicle, then you typically essentially increase inequality rather than reduce it. Therefore, I was wondering a bit when you discuss just transition in Poland right now. My country, Germany, has been now implemented just transition package for speeding up the coal phase out that has a close to 3 billion euro price tag. What is the planning here on the Polish side? Do you plan to mimic the German example of a really massive program? And if so, how do you intend to finance that?
Thank you. This idea of just transition has to be put into the context of how much climate transition differs from energy transition. We used to speak about just transition in terms of employment, in terms of miners. That's what belongs, in my opinion, to energy transition. But climate transition is a much wider concept. It covers more sectors of activities, not only energy, not only heating, but transport, industry, agriculture, and some very unexpected stakeholders in this discussion emerged. The same moment when I was managing COP24 in Katowice in December 2018, on the streets of Paris, more than 200,000 people protested, not against losing their jobs in the mining sector, because that's not the problem of French economy, but against an increase of price of gasoline and the creation of transport exclusion. So Yellow Vests is a reminder to us that this concept of just transition must be somehow seen as a wider one than only attached to employment. And this is why also, by the way, when I was speaking about declaration on just transition in Katowice, I spoke about Silesia Declaration on Just Transition and Solidarity, because the word solidarity here is absolutely crucial and will be increasingly crucial. That's my first answer. The second answer is when we are speaking about just transition and about regional distributional effect of climate policies, we need to take into account endowment in capital. Basically, we are heading to a capital-intensive revolution. We are moving from a resource-intensive economy, from a labor-intensive economy, to a capital-intensive economy. When you are speaking about an electric vehicle, about a photovoltaic panel, about a windmill, basically, it's an equipment which is costly to be bought. It's the capex costs in the accountancy world is high, but the opex are low or very low. So the question is and we have the same single market between Germany, you mentioned, Georg, and Poland. So on both sides of the other river, you have a Pole earning 1,100 euro and a German earning 3,000 euro, but they are facing the same single market where a Volkswagen ID3 costs both of them 30,000 euro. So how are we going to speak about equality or just transition in this regard? Well, we must somehow balance this endowment in capital to regions which historically are less well prepared for this capital-intensive transition. So this is why we have been discussing with our partners, and this has been reflected in the distribution of recovery fund in the new perspective in Just Transition Fund, that Poland is one of the biggest beneficiaries of this transition. That's great. But let's not forget that this only a very minor amount of money which is needed for this transition to happen. When we are speaking about Just Transition Fund, for Poland, which is the biggest recipient of this fund, 3.5 billion euros are going to come in the next 7 years. But the European Commission expects that by 2040, Poland, only for reaching 40% reduction target, so not the 55% which we have adopted in December, needs 240 billion euros. So we are speaking about public money, which is necessary to be kind of support of initial dotation, but which is absolutely not enough. And we need to combine it with private money, with private capital, and with new jobs. And this is the whole idea behind Just Transition in Poland, is create alternative jobs, create alternative sectors of activities, because that would allow only to mobilize enough money in order not to be touched with this distributional effect you spoke about, Georg.
Georg, perhaps we can say a word, because we moved to the European debate already, and I think you rightly emphasize the fact that there's some European money, but of course a lot of national money. But there is, of course, beyond the Just Transition Fund, there is the Recovery Fund, which is supposed to be spent 30% or so in terms of investments in green technologies, in green infrastructure. Can you just give us a bit of a sense how you see the Recovery Fund money being used to support this transition to green technology in Poland that you described?
Thank you. Yes, what I believe is that we need to use the existing tools, which are very well working in Poland. We have a clean air program. 200,000 buildings since last 18 months only have been renovated in Poland with the clean air program. And that's a lot of money which it demands. My electricity program, another 200,000 households equipping their rooftops with solar PV. So we have tools and they are working, but they need to be fueled with money. This is one element for the recovery fund. The other is creation of, as I said, new activities. Electric mobility is a very important leverage for us in terms of both achieving climate targets, increasing air quality in cities, but also providing with new employment possibilities. And this is the bet we did relatively early, 4 or 5 years ago, saying, yes, electromobility is going to be a trend which will be rising. And we already start to see fruits of this strategy. Poland is the biggest exporter of electric buses within the European Union, is the hub for production of lithium-ion batteries. And now we see a lot of electric mobility industry interested about locating its facility here in Poland. And again, recovery plan can help us. But we need also to make sure that the energy poverty is not increased. Again, when we will create different measures, there is a risk that we increase at the same time cost of electricity, but also more importantly in the Polish context, cost of heat. And so we need to provide buffers in order to help population not to increase the energy poverty.
May I chip in on this industrial or green industrial policy on green vehicles or electric vehicles that you have been mentioning, Minister? I can only congratulate you on the success of your policy there. We have done some work in the also past years, essentially trying to look into which potential low carbon sectors can be deployed in which regions of Europe, because our understanding was it does not make sense to build photovoltaic industry in regions that have no engineers and that don't have a history in linked sectors. And what we did here was trying to identify what are basic strengths that are needed to develop strengths in very specific industrial sectors of the green industry, including electric vehicle industry. And indeed, our results showed that in southern Poland, there has been hubs of potential for building an electric vehicle industry, with engineering happening before, also with electric vehicles themselves being produced even in the 80s. already for specific purposes. And we found it quite illustrative of helping policymakers to better understand where to essentially settle down their green industrial policy, not to build up ivory towers or cathedrals that nobody needs, but things that can really take root in the existing landscape. My question to you based on that would be, now, there is quite significant amounts of money that also Poland will get access to through the Recovery and Resilience Facility. And this money should be spent very quickly in order to boost demand in terms of COVID recovery. But on the other hand, some of those investments that would be needed to really do sustainable industrial policy might essentially take much longer time horizons. Does your government have a position on whether you're trying to kind of roll out a long-term development plan for green industrial policy with that money at the risk of not spending this money tomorrow to help demand?
Very good question. Thank you very much, Georg. We are in the middle of this debate here in the government because we need to have projects which are matured enough in order to benefit from Recovery and Resilience Facility. And I see projects linked with electric mobility, which are indeed in this position. We have projects linked with thermomodernization, as I previously mentioned, not only households, but also buildings of public buildings, schools, etc. So these are quite mature in terms of project making, in terms of know-how, in terms of also ability to deliver behind by our industry on these challenges. Then we have some longer projects linked with, for example, heat pump industry, which will be growing in importance during the next 10 years. And we will not be able to limit the support to this sector in the coming 2, 3, 4 years without thinking of the following years. But we are in the middle of this discussion how to best adjust also the expenses linked with Recovery and Resilience Facility compared with the new perspective of EU funds, which partially also is dedicated to create new opportunities, new industrial opportunities.
Thank you, Minister. We are coming almost the end of our conversation. So I would like to really ask you at the end a question which is quite connected to where we started, which is the COP and the international climate diplomacy. So you as an insider who has been at the COP and who has run the COP in Katowice, you will have views on what's next in international climate diplomacy and what should be the EU's position and what is Poland's position within the EU on these issues. And perhaps I can push you really on one issue which is sort of very much in the debate and where I also have strong views on, which is really this carbon border adjustment mechanism and whether or not this will help us to make the European Green Deal not just European but global. Because it is clear if only the EU is doing significant climate ambitions, world climate doesn't change much because we are emitting less than 10% of global emissions. The biggest emitters are China and the United States. If you look at the country ranking. So clearly we will have to succeed globally with reducing climate emissions. And my view is really that we need some sort of a climate club between countries, like-minded countries that agree on significant climate action and agree also that those outside of that climate club, if they do less ambitious climate action, they need to face some sort of a carbon border adjustment mechanism as they export goods into the club. And so your views on what kind of club countries one could see, how the EU could position itself, should the EU find a way of doing something with the new Joe Biden administration, a climate club, perhaps a transatlantic climate club? I mean, what is your view really on the international climate diplomacy and how to move forward there?
I think we have a very interesting development in the last weeks of 2020, alignment between major economic blocs on its ambition towards climate neutrality. We have, of course, European Union, but then We have Japan, Korea, within a few days declaring climate neutrality target by 2050. And which was, I think, unexpected to many, including in China, a target of carbon neutrality for China for 2060. And then on the other side of the Pacific or Atlantic Ocean, looking from, depending which sides of this equation, we have Joe Biden declaring that the day one of his administration, he will come back to the Paris Agreement and a very ambitious objectives which are behind his new climate policy, at the heart, in fact, of the Biden administration. So we have an alignment of stars in terms of ambition. And right now, indeed, I think, and that's my take also after Katowice COP, that the key question is not anymore only to increase the target, but to ask ourselves how to achieve this target in a manner which would be economically, technologally, and socially feasible. And when I was speaking about this after COP with my colleagues and including with Antonio Guterres, I was advocating for a necessity to create a place, you call it club, Güntram, but I was speaking about an institution, about the place, where such a coordination could be somehow done and where we could provide states with some kinds of guidelines, roadmaps, and also necessary synchronization of spendings, because and in the situation of post-COVID recovery, I think it's even more important that we have this place, because otherwise you have Japan spending hundreds of billions of dollars for this purpose, Korea declaring $60 billion only for renewables, then Joe Biden declaring $400 billion for research and development agenda. Then we have Europe, a lot of money which is going in this, and we have no place to discuss it. And my conclusion is that we need a place like OECD, and OECD is the right place, I think, to discuss because it has a global outreach, it has the expertise, it has brain power to provide with meaningful expertise to member states, but also it has its global outreach in terms of getting into this discussion other non-OECD member states as well, such as China, India, Indonesia, and Brazil, not yet a member of OECD. And in this regard, I think it will be extremely interesting to follow what will happen with trade. And you mentioned carbon border adjustment mechanism. This is an initiative which will be proposed in European Union, and it helps to protect industries in this transitional phase, which are increasing the costs of producing steel, cement, fertilizers, but at the same time, in order for them not to suffer from the competition of third countries, not putting in place such ambitious climate policies. So this carbon border adjustment mechanism is necessary in this world. But as you say, it will engage a completely new and very complicated discussion on the future of trade in the light of the climate policy. And here, I expect a lot to happen starting from mid of this year. And the discussion on carbon border adjustment mechanism will be essentially between OECD and non-OECD member states, because as we are discussing also with some colleagues in US, Biden administration people are aware of the fact that such an instrument is being put in place in Europe. And I think that there is a lot of discussions also whether US could be creating such an instrument. So in this regard, we would have a very interesting new axis of very dynamic discussion between transatlantic economic powers and China.
Minister, I'm afraid our time is already coming to an end. It was fascinating to discuss all these various aspects of Polish and international climate policy with you, and I would like to thank you for engaging with us and for the great discussion. I'm sure it will not be our last discussion on especially the climate diplomacy aspects. Perhaps we can even host you for another debate later in the year when this topic will again be very, very relevant. So thank you so much for joining us, Minister, and thank you, Georg, for also injecting your ideas into this conversation. And thank you to our listeners for listening to our podcast. Please do follow us on our podcast or visit also our website at www.brügel.org to get more information on these and related topics. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.